On November 10th, 1985, a hunter walking near the edge of Bear Brook State Park in Allenstown, New Hampshire, stumbled upon a rusted 55-gallon barrel tipped over in the woods. Inside, he found the skeletal remains of a woman and a young girl, both wrapped in plastic. Authorities searched for answers, but the victims remained unidentified and the case went cold. Then, 15 years later, investigators returned to the scene and made a chilling discovery. Another barrel, just 150 yards away, containing the remains of 2 more young girls. It was almost impossible to believe, and as the investigation continued, the dark truth behind the Bear Brook murders slowly began to unravel. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Crime Weekly. I'm Stephanie Harlow.
And I'm Derek Levasseur.
And today, as you could hear from the teaser, we're diving into a brand new series, the Bear Brook Murders, also known as the Allenstown 4. So we are going to get right into it. But first, is there anything you want to talk about? Anything you want to get out of the way before we get into case mode?
No, ready to go. Let's do it.
All right, so on November 10th, 1985, a police officer in Allenstown, New Hampshire, received a call from dispatch to meet a hunter near the edge of Bear Brook State Park, the largest developed state park in New Hampshire, spanning over 10,000 acres. When this officer arrived, he found the hunter looking pale and shaken. The hunter told him, quote, "There's a barrel up in the woods, and I think there's some bones in there," end quote. The officer followed the hunter's lead and located a slightly rusted, dark blue, 55-gallon steel drum just off a trail on private property. The barrel had been tipped over, exposing a plastic bag inside. When the officer opened the bag, he found the skeletal remains of 2 victims. Both were nude, wrapped in plastic, and bound with Carol cable electrical wire. Authorities searched the area for additional evidence, clothing, personal items, or other remains, but they didn't find anything else. The victims' remains were flown to a hospital in Augusta, Maine, where they were examined by Dr. Marcella Sorg and Dr. Henry Ryan. At that time, Dr. Sorg was the only forensic anthropologist in all of New England, and she was typically brought in to examine skeletonized remains, cases that a standard pathologist wasn't trained to handle. Through their examination, Sorg and Ryan determined that the remains belonged to 2 females. One was an adult between 23 and 33 years old, and the other was a young girl between 8 and 10 years old. The adult victim was between 5'4" and 5'7" with curly light brown hair, and the child was around 4'3" with light brown to blonde hair. Based on Sorg and Ryan's initial analysis, both victims were believed to be either Caucasian or Native American. Later advancements in technology would refine these descriptions, but at the time, this was the best estimate they could provide. Both victims had been killed by a blunt force trauma to the head, though the doctors couldn't rule out the possibility of additional injuries. Their remains showed evidence of some dismemberment, and based on decomposition, they had been dead for at least a year. As you can imagine, the autopsies weren't easy to complete. Dr. Sorg later explained that severe decomposition always made identification difficult, but in this case, the plastic wrapping around the bodies complicated things even further. She said, quote, "The presence of plastic reduces our ability to predict because it diminishes the access of insects, which delays decomposition. Since the bodies were wrapped in plastic, it could mean that the bodies could have been there longer," end quote.
Yeah, that's interesting that the plastic, obviously it's used for whatever methodology because of the offender, what they're trying to do, maybe transportation. They don't want to have trace evidence left behind in a vehicle or whatever it might be. And yet it actually throws off investigators as well because it almost serves as like a preservation. And by no means am I a pathologist, but in many instances, experts will use the development of fly larvae, insect activity to determine how long a body has been there. And that will obviously be contributed to also the decomposition levels that you have and where they are in that process. So without that, this plastic may have actually helped the offender because it almost serves as kind of like this preservation technique where it throws off the time of death and they can't determine how long the bodies have been there. That may have been intentional. It may have been just luck, but either way, the facts are the facts, and that's what they're left with. And all these variables in these cases can definitely have an impact on it. I remember we worked a case where we found a body, and the body was out there, different types of weather. It was at a certain stage in the decomposition process, but there was a theory that potentially the body had been wrapped at one point, and then the offender revisited the crime scene and unwrapped the body to throw investigators off, right? To make it look like, hey, this body has been exposed to the elements the whole time, so it's only been here a very short duration. So what we actually did, and I know some people won't agree with this, but they had a pig fetus that was available, and they put it out there during the same time of year, and to see what type of insect activity would be caused and how long it would take and how long before that pig fetus would be at the same level of decomposition of the body that we found to determine whether or not it aligned. So these are the types of techniques, although I'm a big animal person, not a huge fan of it, but that's what we had at the time and that's what was done. But these are the types of complications that can happen in any case that you don't often hear about, but these are the hurdles that you have to jump over throughout the investigation just to try to determine when the bodies were left there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's interesting because we're talking about Dr. Marcella Sorg, and it seems like she's the person she's the go-to person. It reminds me of that show Bones. I don't know if you ever saw it, but there's this specific...
I've heard of it. I haven't watched it.
Yeah, there's like this, but she's got this specific talent. And at that time, especially, the only one really on the East Coast who did have this specific talent, because sometimes when you're going to find these human remains, they are going to be, greatly decomposed. And all of these factors, like she was talking about, like you were talking about, are going to affect that. And she's going to be able to sort of piece things together and see behind the curtain. She's got this talent for doing it. And luckily, she was at the University of Maine at the time. And she says that... I read an article where she was interviewed just a few years ago because she's still doing this. And she said that analyzing human remains is kind of like this side gig for her, that this wasn't her main job. Her primary focus was public policy and epidemiology, but she's analyzed hundreds of these kinds of cases in her 42 years of examining human remains. And she says that the first step she would do is to catalog the condition of each bone before she handles them. Sometimes she even x-rays them to see if there's any foreign objects lodged in them. And then she examines their condition and completes an inventory of what she has and what's missing. And she says sometimes it's even necessary to have to clean the bones so you can see the surfaces better. Then you look at every single bone to rule out any sign of trauma and to better understand what happened at death. And she says there's a decreasing curve when it comes to how much can be learned from remains that have been degraded by time and exposure. She said there's always something that can be learned. And she's cited many cases where she had cremated remains that she was still able to get information from.
That's crazy.
So I know. It's very, very interesting. And I think she just has this sort of eye for it, this sort of brain for it. But to be able to understand that the plastic covering the remains stops the insect activity, which we would think almost as the layman would be better because you'd have more.
Yeah, it's like, it's preserved.
Yeah, you have more to go from, but it doesn't help her at all when trying to consider time of death because they use this insect activity as an indicator of time of death. So this threw it all off. And remember, they said, listen, they could have died within the past year. But initially, they were saying they really didn't know. And I have the notes here. Initially, they said that they could have been killed sometime between 1977 and 1985.
That's a big window.
That's a big window, right? And mainly that's because of the plastic deterring that insect activity.
Is it stupid for me to say, like, when we talk about insect activity and how these pathologists or these medical examiners are able to do this, from your perspective, is that common knowledge how they do that, or should I give a little bit more detail on that? Because I'm a little self-conscious. I'm not gonna lie. I was reading some of the reviews, and I know that's the worst thing you can do, but I always like the feedback. And I've been accused lately of mansplaining, and it's like I would call it cop-splaining. That's kind of my role in this whole thing, is to give you guys some insight as far as what we do as investigators, because not everybody who does these types of crime cases has that actual experience. But would it be, as a woman, would it be considered mansplaining if I explain how insect activity is used to determine how long a body's been there? Or do you think that's common sense? I'm asking that not sarcastically.
Yeah, I don't think it's mansplaining.
Yeah.
I think that's probably not common knowledge, maybe for people who consume a lot of true crime content, but simply because they've heard it in other content. I don't think this is something that they teach you in school. So I would encourage you to mansplain away.
Quick version of it. When obviously there's a body out there, you've seen it with food or whatever, insects are going to be drawn to that, right? So the insects will be drawn to that. They will leave behind eggs, larvae, right? Those eggs will then develop into babies. I don't know what the correct terms are. And then the insects will develop into full grown, whatever they are, flies, whatever it might be. And so then you can have medical examiners, entomologists come in, take those fly insects, the larvae, whatever it might be, all the different stages, and they can determine a relative amount of time that the insects have been here. Because when that body is left out there, pretty quickly, the insects are going to find it. So based on what they can find in the different stages of the insects that are found on the body, they can determine how long the body has been there. How's that?
Yeah, that's good.
Right? The different cycle that the insects are in, they will take a petri dish, they'll take multiple samples, they'll put them under a microscope, and an entomologist will say, yeah, based on what I'm seeing here, based on the colony or whatever they would call it that's on the body, I would say that this is probably 4 or 6 weeks into development. So they're not even using the body's decomposition, they're using the insect activity. They will also use the body. It's not like they completely just don't look at it.
It's just one of the tools.
This is a very good tool that's a lot more accurate for them and easier to kind of dissect.
Yes.
So there's my mansplaining for the episode.
Okay, so the mansplaining for the episode is done. We can check that off the list of things
It was
we
a
have to
couple
do.
people. Now, mind you, there's hundreds of thousands of people who listen to us. So 2 comments on it, I think we're okay. But I do see it, and you're always trying to make adjustments. And I'm like, man, I got to really understand as a man what mansplaining is, because I feel like whenever I go into something, more than likely it's something of I thought value as a law enforcement officer. But I do think what happens in some cases is true crime is so advanced now, right? Where there are people who are watching our episodes, they're watching other people's episodes, and they've kind of become, an expert on some of this stuff where they've heard these terms before. It's been explained to them multiple times. So when they hear someone like me saying, oh, this is what we're talking about, they're like, man, that's mansplaining. I already know that, but not everybody does. That's what I would say.
I would absolutely agree. I have not seen the comments accusing you of mansplaining, but I believe that they are there.
They are there.
It's crazy.
We actually had someone do that in person too, by the way. Do you remember that?
I do. I thought they were joking.
It was we talked about it, I think, on this one of these episodes. It was years ago.
Yeah.
But someone came up to us and was like, oh, I love you guys. Derek, you do a lot of mansplaining. And I was like, awesome. Cool.
You were like, nice to meet you.
I was like, have a good day.
Yeah. I don't know. I like it. I like to learn. So, and I don't know everything. And even if I do know like a little bit of it, like I knew a little bit how insect activity worked as far as dating, time of death, but I didn't know to that extent. I just know it is. So,
well, now we all have a little bit of knowledge. I'm not an expert on it either. That's why we were there. Many times you won't even collect it. They'll have someone out there who's collecting it to make sure that they can analyze it. But yeah, and that's what we did with the pig, right? Because they went out there, they collected all different samples from all over the pig, and they said, yeah, this is the beginning of 1 cycle, this is the start of 2 cycles. Okay, so they've gone through 3 reproductive cycles on this fetus, which means 14 days, whatever it is. It's pretty cool.
It's very interesting. I find it very interesting.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, despite all of the unknowns, authorities felt confident that the bodies had been left at the scene at the same time. What they weren't sure about was whether the 2 had been killed in the woods or if they'd been murdered somewhere else and then dumped there. Authorities worked to identify the victims, checking state and federal databases for any missing persons cases that matched, but they couldn't find anything. Investigators also went door to door in a nearby mobile home park, interviewing nearly all of its residents to see if anyone had noticed anything suspicious around the time that the bodies were left there. Now, this mobile park was called Bear Brook Gardens. It was located several hundred yards from the bodies, and the residents there were basically long-term, mostly working people. And one of the residents said, quote, "This is a nice secluded area. We've been here for 4 years now, and this is an extremely stable park with no rental units," end quote. So basically what he's saying is like, hey, there's not just people coming and going, coming for short-term rentals, staying here 3 months and leaving. We've all pretty much been here. Even if the bodies were found 5 years ago or if they found 1 year ago, we've all pretty much been here for a while.
That is my first thought too, by the way. Like when you said where it is, the location, you would think that the offender had some type of familiarity with this area. It doesn't seem like the bodies were meant to be found, so they put them there for a reason.
I'm sure that they weren't meant to be found, right?
So the person who put them there felt like this was a location that would go undiscovered. And how would they know that? They would have a familiarity with the area. They would know that it's not a high traffic location, pretty consistent residents there. People wouldn't necessarily go over to this specific area. So how do you get that knowledge? Well, you've been there before. You've spent some time there. At least that's the initial thought.
Well, another resident said, quote, "It's kind of surprising that nobody found them before. But as I understand it, there are some roads that come down right into there from Deerfield Road. You could drive a truck right into there and nobody would think much about it. Everybody's a little shook up. It's kind of scary, actually, living out in the boonies. You expect to be immune from that sort of thing," end quote. So basically what he's saying is, hey, you wouldn't even have to walk out here with this barrel. You can, there's a road there. It goes through the woods. You can drive a truck right up here, dump these barrels off, and go on with your day. But here's the thing. Decades later, it would be revealed that someone had found the barrel months earlier. During the summer of 1985, 11-year-old Jesse, who lived in that mobile home park, he was playing hide and seek with his friends when one of the kids ran up to him saying he'd just come across a barrel in the middle of the woods off the main trail. Jesse thought it was strange that a barrel would be out there in the first place, so he hopped on his four-wheeler and he went to check it out with the other kids. When they got there, the boy who had first spotted the barrel tried to lift the top. The second he did, a putrid smell hit them so hard that they immediately recoiled. Then one of the kids gave the barrel a shove, knocking it onto its side. They stood there for a moment staring at it before all of them scrambled onto Jesse's four-wheeler and got out of there just as fast as they could. None of them had any idea what they had just come across. So this is very interesting because remember the barrel's found on its side. And now we kind of know that whoever left the barrel there originally probably didn't leave it on its side, right? Like Derek said, this person was not hoping for these bodies to be found. Otherwise, he would have wrapped them in plastic, put them in a barrel with a top on it. When the person or persons left the barrel there, it was standing upright. And these kids, these curious kids, they knocked it over.
Yeah. And now I'm kind of going back on what I said 2 minutes ago as it's kind of developing here, where it does appear that even if you weren't familiar with the actual mobile park, there is a trail there, there's a road there. So
snowmobile trails too, yeah.
Yeah, so could it be someone who has no familiarity with the trailer park, or I should say the mobile park, whatever you want to refer to it as, and could have been just driving by and happened to leave it near the Bear Brook Mobile Park? That's also possible. So
not knowing that it was even there.
Right. I do retract my statement. Now hearing a little bit more, maybe we can't pinpoint it to that mobile park. It could have been anybody just driving by who said, hey, listen, this is a remote location. That's where I'm going to leave the barrel.
Yeah, it could have been any of those things, though.
Yeah.
We can't discount anything right away.
I don't want to go too far off the path here because we're on part 1 of a multiple part series and we're in like the first 20 minutes of it. But there's so many things running through my head already because I'm envisioning this barrel and I'm thinking about transportation to get it to that location. If it's not someone from the mobile park and they didn't just roll it out there, well, then how did they transport it by vehicle? That would have to be some type of pickup truck, more than likely. So that's some of the thoughts that are running through my head right now. That's subject to change, but I got a million things that I'm writing down right now. I got to slow down.
All right, well, let's take a quick break and we'll be right back. This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep, and Helix is running a great sale right now, so it's the perfect time to upgrade your mattress. I've been sleeping on my Helix Midnight Luxe mattress for, I think, almost or over 5 years right now, and it is just as good today as the first day I ever slept on it. Helix Sleep makes premium mattresses and bedding that are customized to fit your needs and conveniently shipped right to your door. The Helix lineup features 20 unique mattresses, including their award-winning Luxe and Ultra Premium Elite collections. They also have a Helix Mattress Plus, which is designed for big and tall sleepers. They have a Helix Kids Mattress, which is designed for growing bodies and has a flippable sort of design. And if you feel overwhelmed at all the choices and all the different mattresses that Helix has to offer, you can take their quick sleep quiz. What's great about Helix is if you feel weird about purchasing a mattress, because it is a big purchase, that you haven't slept on yourself, they're going to give you a 100-night sleep trial. So you have more than 3 months to try your new mattress out in your home risk-free. Helix even has a 10-year warranty, and they offer financing options and flexible payment plans. So a great night's sleep is never out of reach. So if you want to try Helix Sleep out for yourself, if you're in the market for a new mattress, Derek's going to tell you how you can.
That's right. Love my Midnight Luxe mattress. We think you guys will love Helix as well. So all you have to do is go to helixsleep.com/crimeweekly for 27% off site-wide. Again, that's helixsleep.com/crimeweekly for 27% off site-wide. One more time, helixsleep.com/crimeweekly.
Okay, we're back and we're continuing on. So 2 days after the bodies were officially recovered, on November 12th, New Hampshire Attorney General Stephen Merrill held a press conference to update the public. He confirmed that investigators were treating the case as a double homicide and said they were hopeful that the victims would be identified soon, possibly within the next week. Merrill explained that the dental remains were in good condition, which is a good sign because hopefully you can identify them through their teeth.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, and authorities believed they would be able to make a positive identification. But surprisingly, even though the dentals that were in good shape, that identification never came. Weeks passed, then months. No one stepped forward, and investigators began to consider the possibility that the women and child weren't from New Hampshire at all. Maybe they'd been killed somewhere else, then brought to the private property near Bear Brook State Park. If that was the case, it would explain why no one in the area had recognized them or called in with information after seeing the media coverage.
Yeah, that also might explain why, if they're looking for local missing persons cases, nothing's coming up. These two young women could be from completely different parts of the country, or at least another state.
Yeah, they said that they compared their teeth to dental records of any highly publicized cases of missing persons in New Hampshire. No match was found. There was no clothing or pieces of evidence found at or around the scene, which also, once again, speaks to the idea or the theory that they were killed elsewhere, put in the barrel, and then brought to the park because there's no...
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's no evidence around. But even if they weren't from New Hampshire, you know, there's the ability to check other missing persons cases and things, right?
The case that's running through my mind right now is the case that we're currently working on for Criminal Coffee down in Houston. There's been some movement in that case, that's all I'll say, but we are running into a situation now where we're trying to find the family members of a particular missing persons case that may be linked to what we're working on, but it's easier said than done. Put it that way. So when you think about it, we have a specific location and family that we're looking for, and it's still difficult. Think about the New England area. I'm from Rhode Island. You're from New York. You're not in the New England area, but it's a lot around there. Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island. Many, 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 many missing persons cases over a variety of years. They could be any of them. And so without having a unified database, you have obviously NamUs and things like that you can look into, but it's a needle in a haystack. It really is. Unless you start going through each one by one and looking at the descriptions of each victim to see if they match. And how many victims are you going to find between, what did we say, 23 and 33 that are approximately that height? It's going to be in the hundreds, if not thousands. And that's what makes it so difficult. And it is a painstaking process, but someone has to do it. Somebody has to do it.
Well, they kind of did, right? So in February of 1986, the state police issued a drawing of the older of the two victims, the adult victim, after trying for months to match descriptions and dental records from the corpses with info about missing persons on file at the National Crime Information Center in Washington, D.C., and the computer came up with almost 800 matches. And Lieutenant Martin Heon, who was a spokesperson for the state police major crime unit at that time, said, quote, "We've eliminated close to 300 as of last week. We still have more than 400 to go, but the bottom line is the remains do not match any descriptions we have received," end quote. And it's not usually necessary for law enforcement to have to circulate a drawing of a victim. You know, we've seen them do that in the instance of offenders, but usually not of a victim. But the remains were so badly decomposed that no fingerprints or other identifiable marks existed to help the investigators. So they had a drawing done by Peggy Caldwell, who is a forensic pathologist from New York. And at that time, she was one of the few people trained to create images of people based on their skeletons. And so she used information and photos provided by Dr. Marcel Sorg, and she was able to come up with a drawing that they then used to help them, you know, sort of circulate these pictures. Like, have you seen this person? Have you seen this person?
I'm all over the place here. I know. This case is fascinating already, but the number one question I have, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners and viewers are going to have as well, and we're probably going to get there, but what's the number one question everyone should be asking right now? Are they related? Are these two related? Is it a sister-sister? Is it a mother-daughter? Number one thing that you can do, you have both bodies, run the DNA test, and you want to figure out if they're related. Why would we want to do that, Stephanie? Pretty simple, right? We're talking.
Well, it's easier to find, you know, two people from the same family that are missing. Yeah.
Right? Bingo. So not only is an 8 to 10-year-old something that you would expect to see more in the news, right? Because an 8 to 10-year-old goes missing, everybody should be looking for them, right?
Of course, yeah.
23-year-old to 33-year-old, it could be a case where they think this person is just traveling or something like that. They have the right to be on their own. But an 8 to 10-year-old goes missing, people are going to be aware of it. More importantly,
unless that 8 to 10-year-old goes missing with her mother.
There you go. There you go. Look at you. Here we go. Here we go.
And then they might think, oh, she just took off. Maybe there's a custody battle. Maybe the mother took the daughter so the father wouldn't get her. And so maybe they're not going to look as hard because they think this child is in the custody of a responsible adult who is their parent.
Right. Or if these two people are missing now, it's going to be easier to narrow down your pool of people you're searching for. What's easier than trying to find a 22 to 33-year-old woman? A 22 to 33-year-old woman who also went missing with her 8 to 10-year-old daughter.
Yes.
Not as many of those cases out there. And so that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to make our job easier. We're trying to narrow down our search pool.
Well, they couldn't, but even so, they couldn't, right? Which is kind of crazy to me because you'd think that they would have put that together and kind of maybe done that. Like, hey, go to the surrounding states even. Hey, is there any cases of a mother and a daughter who went missing or who took off? Or maybe they weren't reported missing because the family thought that they were together, so they were fine. Maybe there was a reason for them to leave. I mean, this mother and daughter could have left for a legitimate reason. Maybe they were escaping an abusive home. Maybe they were just looking for some new place to live. And then foul play befell them as they were on this journey. We don't know. But are there any cases like this? And they just couldn't find anything like that. So by 1987, with the victims still unidentified, they were buried together in a local Allenstown cemetery under a donated gravestone. The inscription read, "Here lies the mortal remains, known only to God, of a woman aged 23 to 33 and a girl child aged 8 to 10. Their slain bodies were found on November 10th, 1985 in Bear Brook State Park. May their souls find peace in God's loving care," end quote. And after that, the case pretty much faded from the public eye. For the next 15 years, there was little to no reporting on it at all. But in 2000, the case was reopened and investigators decided to search the wooded area where the first barrel had been found, this time with a fresh team and a renewed focus. On May 9th, a state trooper was combing through the woods when he spotted another 55-gallon barrel, this one sitting about 150 yards away from where the first had been discovered. And that's not a very far distance, 150 yards, not a far distance.
Close.
And what you got here is it's not only is it not a far distance, but it's the same MO, which kind of definitely means it's the same person, unless you have a copycat who saw the 1985 case. That's a whole nother can of worms. So when investigators opened the barrel, they found the remains of 2 young girls. Forensic testing later concluded one of the children was between 2 and 4 years old. She had brown hair and stood somewhere between 3'3" and 3'9". She also had a noticeable overbite. The other child was even younger, between 1 and 3 years old, with brown or blonde hair standing between 2'1" and 2'6". She had a distinct gap between her 2 front teeth. Based on early forensic analysis, both girls were believed to be either Caucasian or Native American. Given the circumstances, authorities believed the second barrel was directly connected to the first. They determined it had likely been there the entire time, somehow missed during the initial search back in 1985.
Unbelievable.
Believe it or not.
Yeah. What do you want me to say? Terrible.
I don't know anymore.
You think they would have known? I mean, I hope there's something more to it where they just
150 yards, dude.
Yeah, that's not that far.
Derek's like, what do you want me to say? And I'm like, at this point, I can't even. I feel like we are all on the same page where it's pretty important to do a thorough search of the area. And if you're going to say something like, no clothing, no evidence was found, but there's a whole ass another barrel there, it's a little messed up.
Yeah, no, not good. And listen, I've talked about a case. Some of you heard it, some of you maybe not, where we had an officer go into an apartment and they're like, yep, apartment's clear. And then we went in there and looked behind the door and there were 2 bodies. This is a small apartment. These mistakes happen. So it could just be a absolutely ridiculous mistake by law enforcement, or maybe if we were there, I don't know. I don't know how you would explain 150 yards. The area should have been searched. I'm just going to leave it at that. I'm not going to make excuses. I don't understand it. Unless the barrel was buried, there's no excuse.
The barrel was not buried.
Then there you go.
And I don't know how they would have determined, like, oh, we believe it's been here this whole amount of time. They could be wrong about that. I'm just going to say they could be wrong about that.
Yeah, absolutely. They could be. I mean, there's probably ways they can tell, but...
I mean, they could have said, oh, based on erosion, it looks like it's been out here this long, but it could have been outside somewhere else. Like, I'm just hoping that barrel was not there in the 80s when the first one was found. I'm hoping that they're wrong about that barrel being there. But so the authorities later exhumed the remains from the first barrel to compare them with the bodies in the second, and forensic testing was conducted to determine whether any of the victims were related. The results showed that the adult woman and at least 2 of the children were likely related, perhaps a mother and 2 of her daughters.
There you go.
But the child between 2 and 4 years old was not biologically connected to the others, which just deepens this mystery. Now, despite this major development, there was little media coverage of the case. A detective with the New Hampshire State Police later said that although investigators continued working the case, it eventually hit a dead end and went cold. Without the kind of widespread attention that cases receive today through the 24-hour news cycle and social media, awareness of the Bear Brook murders faded into the background. Then, in early 2013, authorities announced they were officially reopening the case. They revealed that even after nearly 3 decades, the identities of all 4 victims were still unknown, and no one had ever come forward to report a woman and multiple children missing from their family. New Hampshire Senior Assistant Attorney General Jeffrey Strausen called it one of the most unusual cases the state and the country had ever seen. He stated, quote, "This is a very unusual case for New Hampshire. It's an unusual case nationwide to have 4 people go missing and no one come forward." End quote. Strausen also shared that the investigation had received a major boost. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had provided $30,000 in funding to support enhanced DNA testing, which would help conclusively determine how or if the victims were related. State officials were also working on new forensic sketches to try and capture what the victims could have looked like when they were alive. Strausen said that while tips had trickled in over the years, none had led to a break in the case. He shared, quote, "It's horrifying that someone has gotten away with something like this for so long. Have they harmed someone else in the meantime? And could they harm additional people in the future?" End quote. Strausen acknowledged that the passage of time was both a help and a hindrance to the investigation. On one hand, witnesses who may have once held valuable information could have since passed away. But on the other hand, those who had been too afraid to speak up years ago might finally feel safe enough to come forward. In June of 2013, updated sketches of what the victims might have looked like were released to the public. The sketches were in grayscale, as certain physical characteristics, such as skin tone and eye color, were still unknown. The forensic artist who was working on the images for NCMEC explained the reasoning behind this approach, saying, quote, "We want the public to look at them with some level of ambiguity. Ambiguity is the big word. They're not meant to be photographic," end quote. At the same time, authorities also shared an important update regarding the victims' relationship to one another. DNA testing had confirmed that the adult woman was related to two of the girls, meaning she could have been their mother, older sister, or aunt. But the third child, the one estimated to be between 2 and 4 years old, was not related to the others, and this new detail added another layer of mystery to the case.
Let me weigh in here real quick, because to me, what this looks like, what you could have is you have this older woman who's related to the 8 to 10-year-old to the 1 to 3-year-old. The 2 to 4-year-old could be a friend or a neighbor of this.
Or a stepchild.
Or a stepchild. Yeah, that's possible too, or a stepchild, but there's definitely a relation here. These four were, I don't think they were brought there at different times. I don't think this was a dumping ground for a serial killer and all 4 victims were killed on different occasions. It could be a serial killer. I'm not saying that it's not, but it appears that all 4 of these women are somehow connected. And if we had the answers to this case, we're probably going to find that there's a correlation here. Even though the 2 to 4-year-old isn't familial match, she is someone who is going to be connected to them in some way, shape, or form.
Oh, absolutely. I think exactly right, where they might not be related by blood, but there's some relation. They're not randomly connected. Yeah.
There's a story there.
The investigation continued, and in November 2015, on the 30th anniversary of the first barrel's discovery, the New Hampshire Attorney General's office held a press conference to share several new findings. One of the biggest developments was that forensic testing had been conducted on the remains in an effort to learn more about who these victims were and where they may have come from. One of the key tests performed was an isotope analysis, a forensic technique that examines elements in a person's teeth, bones, hair, and nails to determine patterns in their diet, travel history, and region of origin. I'm actually very interested in isotope analysis. They can show you, based on the analysis of things like your teeth specifically, and yes, your hair too, but I think to a lesser extent, but your bones and your teeth, how old you were, or if you lived on the earth at a time when like a nuclear bomb was detonated, because of the radiation released into the atmosphere. Even if you weren't in the same location of the world that it happened, it still went into the atmosphere and goes into your teeth and bones, almost like the rings in a tree trunk. It's super, super interesting.
I mean, it sounds interesting, other than the fact that I feel like you're women-splaining to me, but you know.
I'm woman-splaining you.
I had to.
I know, little Derek, you don't know about isotope analysis. No, there's a mystery, and I don't know if you've ever heard of it. It's called the Isdell woman, and she was a woman who was found dead in a hotel room, and they couldn't figure out where she was. Like, all the labels had been torn out of her clothes. Everything that could have been identifying about her, she personally removed, so people thought she was a spy, maybe from Russia, and they used isotope analysis on her remains to sort of glean more information about her, where she was born, where she was raised, things like that. Very, very interesting. If anybody's interested in looking more into that, I did do a video about it, but I think that they did it on Unsolved Mysteries as well. Super interesting. I love isotope analysis. Very interesting. Now, the results of this analysis offered the most detailed information yet, because that's how isotope analysis rolls. It's a boss. And it showed where the victims had lived before their deaths. According to the isotope testing, the woman and all 3 girls had spent the last 2 weeks to 3 months of their lives together in the New Hampshire region before they were killed, which they now estimated was somewhere between 1980 and 1984. But before that, the analysis suggested that the woman and her 2 biological daughters had lived in a different location than the non-related child. This is so interesting. Once again, we're going to take a quick break and then we're going to talk more about it when we get back. So I have guilty pleasures just like anybody else, and those guilty pleasures are usually chocolate and carbs. I love bread. It doesn't matter what I'm eating, whether it's a grilled cheese or a buttered dinner roll or a hamburger bun. I love bread in all its forms, but carbs aren't great for you, especially when you're focused on, health goals. But with Hero Bread, you can focus on your health goals and still indulge in the soft, fluffy experience you love guilt-free. It tastes amazing. And they have all sorts of different things. They've got bagels, which I just tried for the first time. They've got Hawaiian rolls. They have tortillas for quesadillas or tacos or whatever. Those are my favorite. The tortillas from Hero Bread are so, so good. So Hero Bread is really going to help you because you'd never know that it's low net carb and high fiber bread from the texture. You'll get the same soft, fluffy experience you know and love with your next savory breakfast sandwich, late night grilled cheese, or family taco Tuesday. And there's no compromises, just flavor. Ultra low net carbs, 0 grams of sugar, and high in fiber. And Hero Bread's going to have all your favorite recipes covered because they have sliced bread, for your regular peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, tortillas, bagels, dinner rolls. They've got it all. So if you want to check Hero Bread out for yourself, Derek's going to tell you how right now.
Yeah, I think they might be monitoring our calls because I got the bagels in the mail as well. And I was like, ooh, this could be a good thing. Absolutely loved them. They were delicious. We think you guys will really enjoy Hero Bread. So if you want to check it out, Hero Bread is offering 10% off your order. All you have to do is go to hero.co and use our code CRIMEWEEKLY at checkout. That's CRIMEWEEKLY, all one word. Once again, that's CRIMEWEEKLY at hero.co. Go check them out. Hero Bread.
Okay, we're back. So the isotope testing showed that the woman and the 2 children that were biologically related to her had spent at least 2 weeks to 3 months of their lives together in New Hampshire before they were killed. But that testing also suggested that this woman and her 2 biological daughters had lived in a different location than the non-related child, which means they now know where they lived before being in New Hampshire and they know where the non-related child lived. Investigators now believed that the woman and her 2 daughters had likely spent much of their lives in New Hampshire or a neighboring state close to the coastline. There was also a chance that they could have been from the West Coast or from a stretch of states ranging from Arizona to Minnesota. But the most probable scenario was that they had lived somewhere in the Northeast. Based on this new forensic evidence, their estimated ages were also adjusted. The woman was likely in her mid-20s, with the 2 girls being around 9 to 10 years old and 2 to 3 years old. The non-related child, who is now believed to have been 3 to 4 years old when she was killed, had a very different geographical history. The isotope analysis suggested that she was born and raised in a separate area before ending up with the others in New Hampshire. She may have spent her early years in northern New Hampshire, northern Maine, Vermont, upstate New York, or further west in places like North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Nevada, or even a small section of southeastern Wyoming. The Attorney General's office was quick to point out that the isotope results were not exact and should not discourage anyone from coming forward with tips, especially if they had information that didn't perfectly align with these forensic findings. The office said that while it was more likely than not that all 4 victims were from the Northeast, similar water sources in other parts of the country meant that the possibility of them having lived elsewhere could not be ruled out entirely. To generate new leads, authorities announced plans for a media blitz targeting areas where the victims may have lived based on the isotope results. They remained hopeful that the renewed effort would finally lead to an identification. The New Hampshire State Police said, quote, 30 years is not a period that causes us so much concern that we think it can't be solved, end quote. At that same time, NCMEC, which is the missing persons database, it released updated lifelike computerized images of what the victims may have looked like in life. While authorities in New Hampshire were working to uncover the identities of the victims found in the barrels, investigators on the other side of the country, more than 3,000 miles away in California, were unknowingly putting together another critical piece of the puzzle. It all started in 1999 when In-soon Jun, a chemist in her early 40s, found herself feeling lonely. Born in Korea, In-soon had moved to the U.S. with her family as a teenager. She'd earned a master's degree and built a successful career as a chemist at Biorad Laboratories. She loved to travel, she was warm and accepting, and she had a natural curiosity about the world around her. But despite all of that, she was still lonely. At some point that year, she placed an ad for a handyman. She wanted someone to help her fix up her house in Richmond, California. A man named Lawrence William Vanner, who went by Larry, responded. Larry was quick to charm her, and by the end of the year, In-soon was smitten. On New Year's Eve, she decided it was time to introduce him to her friends and family. She brought him to a party that night, hopeful that the people she loved most would welcome him into their lives. But it didn't go well. Her friends and family didn't like Larry, not even a little bit. In-soon's friend Renee later said that there was something off about him right away. Quote, "He didn't even look healthy. His face was gray. He smoked constantly. Larry would just grab and gobble up everything on the table and belch and eat more, and then he'd go sit on the couch." End quote. In-soon's cousin Elaine had an even stronger reaction. She said, quote, "The first time I laid eyes on him, I knew he was pure evil. I opened the door to him, and it was the first time in my life that the hairs on the back of my hand raised up. A chill came over me. I couldn't even reach out my hand to shake his hand. He was the creepiest person ever." End quote. Elaine explained that Larry had a hostile stare, an unbelievable backstory, and an attitude that set off alarm bells. He claimed he was a self-made millionaire who owned multiple properties, that he'd once been a colonel in the army, and that he had worked for the CIA. Elaine, skeptical of his stories, pressed him for details about the properties he supposedly owned. Instead of answering, he grew angry. He turned to Elaine, staring her down, and said, quote, "Don't you ever question anything I ever tell you." End quote. Elaine knew something wasn't right, and she later voiced her concerns to her cousin In-soon, but her cousin didn't want to hear them. Over time, the relationship soured, and eventually In-soon sent angry letters accusing Elaine of not understanding their love, and she cut off contact immediately and completely. Isn't it funny, and we've seen so many cases where the sketchiest people always tell their new girlfriends or, the people that they meet through their new girlfriends, I worked for the CIA, I worked for the government. So it's almost this warning, don't ask more about my background because I won't be able to tell you anyways. It's very convenient, actually.
It's convenient, and I also understand, there's an element that's, I guess, sexy kind of. It's ooh, I work for the government, I'm this secret agent. Is that a thing? Would that be a thing for women?
If it was true, but at this point, maybe back in the day, they could have pulled that off. But I feel like at this point, women have smartened up to the point where if you say you work for the CIA, I immediately think you're just lying about everything.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I think we can put that under the red flag category.
It's a red flag, yeah.
Because there's no way to verify that they are, in fact, working for the government. And I will say this for everybody out there. If they are some top secret agent for the government and you're just starting your dating relationship and they're saying, hey, I'm a secret agent for the government, they're already lying to you.
Exactly.
Because they're not supposed to say that. So if they start with that, eject. Get out of there as fast as possible.
Yeah, if they're telling you that they worked for the CIA or do currently work for the CIA, they are either the worst CIA agent ever and wouldn't have survived this long, or they're lying and they just don't want you to question their background, and saying that they worked for a secret agency where they have to have a secret identity is the best and easiest way to prevent any more questions being asked. So officially in the red flag category, I can't believe that in 2025 we have to add lying about working for the CIA in the red flag category, but here we are.
Here we are. Let's take another break. We'll be right back.
So you've heard us talk about Liquid IV on Crime Weekly before. We love Liquid IV, and with flavors like their new Hydration Multiplier Sugar-Free Raspberry Lemonade, which is a bright zero sugar flavor, combining notes of ripe, freshly picked raspberries and citrusy, zesty lemon. You are going to certainly find a flavor that works for you. I know that there's several that I enjoy. I have not tried the new Raspberry Lemonade, but I bet it's good. And I love the sugar-free white peach. I also like the regular Liquid liquid IV grape. They're delicious. And I'm taking liquid IV with me everywhere I go, whether it's the gym, whether I'm coming into work, whether I'm traveling, especially when I'm traveling because I always get dehydrated on the plane. And liquid IV is powered by LIV Hydroscience, which is an optimized ratio of electrolytes, essential vitamins, and clinically tested nutrients that turn ordinary water into extraordinary hydration with 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink and 8 essential vitamins and nutrients. Liquid IV is always non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free, and soy-free. So we definitely love liquid IV here. I'll say I use it every day, every single day. I'm not drinking water without liquid IV, and I have to drink water, so I need my liquid IV. And if you want to try it out for yourself, Derek's going to tell you how.
Yeah, we're actually recording a bunch of episodes today, and if you're watching on YouTube, you can see right now I got my liquid IV bottle with my liquid IV inside, ready to go for the day. We love liquid IV. We think you will as well, so embrace your ritual with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code CRIMEWEEKLY at checkout. That's CRIMEWEEKLY, all one word. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code CRIMEWEEKLY at liquidiv.com.
In August of 2001, Insoon and Larry held an unofficial backyard wedding ceremony, and the two settled into Insoon's home in the 6200 block of Bernard Avenue. And for a while, everything seemed fine. But then, in June of 2002, Insoon stopped answering calls from friends and family altogether. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Her friend Renee grew increasingly concerned and confronted Larry about it, but instead of giving her a straight answer, he gave her a different excuse every time, saying things like, she's busy taking care of her mother, she's getting some therapeutic help, she doesn't like you anymore, she doesn't want you in her life, etc. And Renee didn't buy any of it. She told Larry, quote, "I want Insoon, not you, to tell me that she's done with our relationship or I'm going to get the sheriff involved." End quote. Of course, Insoon never contacted Renee, so Renee followed through on her threat to go to the authorities. Renee went to the police, and homicide detective Roxanne Gruhide was assigned to the case. In September, Gruhide brought Larry in for questioning, hoping to get answers about Insoon's whereabouts. Later, she would recall that he was polite, soft-spoken, and highly intelligent, the kind of man who, with his twinkling blue eyes, could easily charm people into trusting him, which seems like a complete opposite description that Insoon's family and friends gave, where they were like, oh, he was a creep, like right off the bat. I could tell that he was evil. He was just eating and belching everywhere. But the detective here, Roxanne Gruhide, kind of makes him sound way better. Like he's polite, he's highly intelligent, soft-spoken, twinkling blue eyes, charming, things like that. So maybe this guy, Larry, or whoever he is, can sort of become who he needs to be in the moment when, I guess, sitting across the table from a police officer who could mean your freedom or not at that point.
Kicks on the charm. They usually do.
Yeah. But despite his seemingly friendly demeanor, he was completely uncooperative when it came to answering questions about his wife, Insoon. Gruhide said, quote, "He was very smart, very intelligent, very calculated. When I asked him something about where he may have come from or about his history, he stopped talking, kind of leaned in, and basically told me in no uncertain terms that information was none of my business." End quote. Although Larry refused to discuss any personal information, he did agree to provide his fingerprints. And when the results came back, they revealed that Larry wasn't Larry at all. His fingerprints matched the name Curtis Kimball, a wanted fugitive from Santa Cruz County. He had violated parole in a child abandonment case that went all the way back to 1986. Gruhide immediately started digging deeper, trying to understand who this man really was and what had happened in his past. As it turned out, in 1986, more than a decade before he met Insoon, Larry/Curtis had been living under yet another alias. That January, he moved to the Holiday Host RV Park in Scotts Valley, California, using the name Gordon Jensen. He had arrived there with a little girl about 4.5 years old who he introduced as his daughter Lisa. According to Gordon, Lisa's mother had died, leaving him to raise her on his own. Richard and Catherine Decker, an older couple who also lived in the RV park, became friendly with Gordon and Lisa. Over time, they grew concerned about Lisa's well-being, so much so that they started looking into the possibility of having their daughter, who lived in San Bernardino, adopt her. So what are you thinking so far with what we've revealed about this guy, whether his name is Gordon or Larry or Curtis?
My gut is that might not be his name at all. But well, first off, let's acknowledge the obvious. You're not telling me this story because it has nothing to do with the Bear Brook murders, right? There's going to be a tie to it, and I'm assuming this gentleman, whatever his real name is going to end up making a trip over to New Hampshire or somewhere in that area. That's my gut. But it seems like we have a very dangerous individual, someone who is obviously lying about their identity and maybe already a murderer of multiple people, including Unsun. And so that's my thoughts initially. I don't want to go too far down the road, but I know this is going to somehow tie back to our victims at Bear Brook, although I don't think it's Unsun. I think whatever happened to her happened in California. Obviously, it's not going to be the same women, but this just means that there's more than one woman, and the victims that we have at Bear Brook are more than likely a family or a mother and their daughters, something along those lines that this gentleman, I shouldn't even call him a gentleman, but this man is going to come into contact with.
Well, what do you think about him 10 years before he knew Unsun in 1986? Showing up at this RV park in California with a child, a little girl about 4.5 years old, Lisa.
Yeah. Where did she come from?
Where did she come from?
Where did she come from? Where's mom? And when I say where's mom, I mean as in I know he's saying that she died, but is that the truth? Is any of this the truth? What is the real story?
Yeah, and that would give you kind of the right age for one of these victims in the barrels.
It would, and that would maybe explain the one young girl that isn't tied to the other three, but still it doesn't answer who these other three women are. So that's the question right now.
Well, in mid-1986, the Deckers took Lisa, with Gordon's permission, down to Southern California to meet their daughter. And right away, that's kind of like a red flag for me, where it's like, who are you that you would just let these people who you don't really know, like, yeah, they're your neighbors, but you're letting them take your child away from you and travel someplace to meet their daughter, who they hope will adopt your child? You know, this seems kind of off.
A little bit, just a little.
Yeah, and while they're there, Lisa said some things to the Deckers that led them to believe that she either had been abused or was currently being abused. Alarmed, the family contacted the police and began pushing to finalize the adoption, hoping to keep Lisa from being returned to Gordon. But when they tried to reach him, they learned he had abruptly fled the RV park in June of 1986. The Deckers reported Gordon's disappearance to the police, prompting an investigation. And authorities quickly discovered that Gordon Jensen wasn't a real identity.
Shocker.
His fingerprints matched those of Curtis Kimball, which is something that the other detective in the case of Unsun had already figured out, that Larry wasn't Larry, he was Curtis Kimball, based on his fingerprints, which is interesting why he was willing to give his fingerprints to the police, knowing that it would show he wasn't who he claimed to be, and knowing it would make him seem more suspicious in the disappearance of his wife.
Well, at that point, he's probably like, I'm gonna get out of here anyways, because maybe the actual encounter that happens is it was like, hey, they were asking him, but not really, and so he had no choice. But then he knows at that point they're gonna run me, and they're gonna figure out what's going on here. So he's already planning his escape plan at that point. He knows he's got to go.
Well, it's sad because Gordon had abandoned Lisa without signing the adoption papers, so that meant she couldn't legally be adopted by the Deckers' daughter. Instead, she was placed in Child Protective Services in San Bernardino, where she would eventually be adopted by another family, and she grew up believing that this Gordon Jensen figure had been her biological father. And this is another stupid thing about the system, where it's like you have a family here or a woman here ready to adopt this child, and you're like, no, this creep who just abandoned his child didn't sign the papers, so we're going to put her in Child Protective Services for who knows how long. And anybody knows that this isn't the best place for kids, especially young kids. And so the authorities just kind of threw her life into a spiral a little bit more. But meanwhile, an arrest warrant was issued for Gordon, now identified as Curtis Kimball, on 3 felony charges related to child abandonment. But years passed without an arrest. Finally, in March of 1989, Curtis was picked up and taken to jail. He was later convicted and sentenced to 3 years in prison, but in October of 1990, he was granted parole. So literally, this dude abandons his quote-unquote child. He's sentenced to 3 years. He doesn't even serve a full year, right? He goes in March of 1989.
System. Yeah. Isn't it great?
Yeah. Pretty gross. So he was granted parole, and then just 1 day later, surprise, he vanished. A warrant was issued for his arrest, but he was never caught, and he remained a fugitive for the next 12 years. That is, until September of 2002, when Detective Grunheide unknowingly put an end to his time on the run by bringing him in for questioning about the disappearance of his wife, In-Sun Jun. So after Grunheide discovered the extent of Larry/Curtis/Gordon's past, authorities wasted no time in arresting him for being a wanted fugitive. While he was in custody, Grunheide and another detective searched the home that he had shared with In-Sun, which, remember, was In-Sun's house. And in the basement, they discovered something that immediately raised alarm bells: an enormous pile of cat litter. Grunheide later described it as big, like 4 or 5 feet around and probably 2 or 3 feet high. Because at first, when they said they found a pile of cat litter, like a big pile of cat litter, I was thinking, like maybe a bag or two dumped out on the floor. But 4 or 5 feet around and 2 or 3 feet high. That's a lot of cat litter.
Yeah, and you think about the uses of cat litter, not good.
Yeah.
Think about absorption of moisture, hides odors. Yeah, not good.
But there was no odor in this case, nothing that immediately
Well, it wouldn't be with
signaled.
5 pounds of, or 20 pounds of cat litter, would there be? No, I'm just kidding.
I mean, yeah, you're right. There wouldn't be, but
It would be smelling pretty great down there.
You'd also think, like, is this dude really gonna, just leave this here in the house? If he killed In-Sun, is he gonna put her body in the basement and just put cat litter on top?
That might have been extra for a different location where he had buried her.
However, what we're going to find out is he actually was stupid and or careless enough to do exactly that.
Oh.
Because there was an axe leaning against the pile, and the police suspected that In-Sun might be buried underneath this enormous pile of cat litter, so they started digging. And first they found a human foot. It was completely mummified, still wearing a flip-flop. They continued digging, eventually uncovering an entire body, and obviously authorities soon confirmed what they had feared. The remains belonged to In-Sun. She'd been killed by blunt force trauma to the head, and further examination revealed that she had also sustained some dismemberment. And this reminds us of what? The bodies in the barrels.
Yeah,
yep.
Same thing, same MO.
Yep. Grunheide later determined that a man matching Larry's description had purchased 10 bags of cat litter from a nearby pet store, which further tied him to the crime. In November of 2002, he was formally charged with In-Sun's murder. He didn't run. I mean, by this time they had him in custody. He didn't run, but he pleaded not guilty, and for a time, it seemed as though he would fight the charges. I don't know how you possibly could. I don't know how you, what are you going to say? I didn't know that this body was in my basement of my missing wife, who I had not reported missing. Like, what could you possibly say? I don't care if you have Jose Baez as your defense attorney. Try to get out of this.
Yeah, I mean, everyone pleads not guilty initially. It's just kind of the way it goes.
In 2003, in a move that stunned the courtroom, he suddenly stood up at a pretrial hearing and announced that he wanted to plead guilty to the murder. And he was only sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. But for In-Sun's family, there was some relief in knowing that Larry or Gordon or Curtis, whatever his real name was, he was finally being held accountable. But In-Sun's cousin, Renee, had a nagging feeling that this wasn't the end of the story. She had sensed something evil in him from the very beginning, and she believed without a doubt that In-Sun was not his only victim.
So much to unpack here. So much to unpack, and I will say during one of our breaks, I asked Stephanie if this case was solved or not, because I truly didn't know, and she did say it's solved. She didn't tell me how or whatever. So for anybody who's asking, there is some resolution to this. So knowing that little bit of information, there's a lot of thoughts running through my brain. So this one guy, we're calling him Curtis Kimball for now. He comes over to California in around 1986, right? So he gets out to California. He shows up this trailer park. He's got a young girl with him. He says, hey, listen, her mom died. I'm taking care of her. But then he basically leaves this girl behind. And my first thought is, you had posed a question like, oh, what does this sound like? It sounds like the girls that we have over in the Barrows in New Hampshire. But obviously it's not the same girl because the girls there are already dead. They've been dead. So you think about this young girl that he left behind and how she could tie into this whole thing, because at this point, we don't know who her mother is. And we know at this point that quote unquote Curtis Kimball is a killer, right? He's a killer.
Yes,
and
obviously.
His modus operandi is similar to the murders in New Hampshire. So just kind of going down this path, if this is our guy, then the question that I have at this point in the story is, who was that young girl? Who was that young girl? And is she tied?
What's his relation to her?
Yes. What's his relation to her? And if there's no relation, does she have any relation to the 4 victims that we have in New Hampshire? Because if she does, by using her DNA, it'd be very easy to determine that. So that's my initial thought right now is this young girl came from somewhere. He clearly didn't care that much about her because he left her behind for her to basically end up in the adoption system. And where are we? How is she involved in all of this? We know what he's been involved in. We know what he's capable of. Why didn't he kill her, this young girl? Why did he take her with her? There's more to this story. I have way more questions than I have answers right now.
Yes, and you know what? So did Detective Grunheide. And we're going to take our last break, and we're going to come back and talk about that. This episode is brought to you by IQBAR, our exclusive snack sponsor. So IQBAR, it plays such a huge role in my everyday life. I am always grabbing an IQBAR as my on-the-go snack because it satisfies hunger with no sugar crash, and they're easy to put in my bag, my purse, my suitcase, my carry-on, etc. I would say that IQBAR has really helped me lean into health and wellness this year and this past year because their IQBAR products are carefully crafted for superior brain and body performance. Start the new year off right with IQBAR's brain and body boosting bars, hydration mixes, and mushroom coffees. We highly suggest that you try their Ultimate Sampler Pack, which includes all 3. The Ultimate Sampler Pack is a great way to try all the IQBAR products and flavors because you're going to get 7 IQBARs, 4 IQ Mix Sticks, and 4 IQ Joe Sticks. And right now, IQBAR is offering our podcast listeners an exclusive deal, 20% off all IQBAR products, plus you're going to get free shipping. So I always like to focus on the protein bars because they are my favorite. IQBAR makes the #1 brain and body nutrition bar, hydration mix, and instant coffee in the U.S. And if you don't believe us, they have over 15,000 5-star reviews and counting. So Derek's going to tell you how you can check them out for yourself.
That's right. I got my almond butter chip right here, ready for the day. And right now, IQBAR is offering our special podcast listeners and viewers 20% off all IQBAR products, plus get free shipping. To get 20% off, just text weekly to 64,000. Once again, that's weekly to 64,000. One more time, that's weekly to 64,000. Message and data rates may apply. See terms for details.
Okay, so Detective Grunheide felt that there was something about Larry, Curtis, whoever. It just didn't sit right. Something in his past that told her this was just one chapter in a much bigger story.
Oh, yeah.
The more she thought about it, the more she kept circling back to one thing, that little girl that he had abandoned years earlier, Lisa. Grunheide later said, quote, I was really centered on the little girl, on Lisa. Like, was this really his daughter? If it's not his daughter, where did he get her? Who did he get her from? End quote. And Detective Grunheide really believed that Larry's sudden decision to plead guilty had nothing to do with remorse or doing the right thing. Instead, she was convinced that he had overheard her speaking with another investigator in court, where she had mentioned wanting to request a paternity test for Lisa, who at that point was now in her early 20s. Grunheide shared, quote, I think he believed if he pled guilty, I would stop investigating that aspect of his past, end quote. But if that's what Larry was hoping for, he was wrong. If anything, Grunheide was more motivated than ever. She did order the paternity test using Larry's DNA from his recent arrest and a sample of Lisa's DNA obtained back in 1986. A few weeks later, the results came back, confirming what Grunheide had suspected all along. Larry was not biologically related to Lisa.
No.
Yeah.
What a shocker.
Yeah. Which means that not only does Lisa have a set of parents out there somewhere, alive or dead, but how did this man, who, like you said, is a killer, is not a good person, how did he come to be in, I guess, possession of this child? Right. And
why didn't he kill her?
Why didn't he kill her?
Yeah.
Right.
There's something to it.
Well, this revelation raised even more questions than it answered. If Lisa wasn't actually Lisa Jensen, the name she'd gone by her entire life, then who was she? And what had happened to her real parents? Grunheide reached out to the authorities in San Bernardino, who had taken custody of Lisa in 1986, to let them know that they had an active living Jane Doe case, a missing child who had been found alive as an adult, but without an identity. San Bernardino made contact with Lisa and explained everything. Then they tried to use ancestry databases to uncover Lisa's real identity, but at that time, the databases were just too small. There was no immediate answer to the mystery of who Lisa truly was.
Ooh, I have a feeling Lisa's going to have ties to New Hampshire.
Yeah, or ties to, somehow she's going to tie back to these bodies in the barrels.
Yeah, absolutely. He came out to California for a reason, and what's the furthest place from New Hampshire?
Yeah, the West Coast. That's where everybody runs away to, right?
That's it. I mean, if you're going to avoid apprehension, go to the furthest place you can.
Well, years passed with no leads. And during that time, Larry died in prison in December 2010 from a combination of pulmonary emphysema, pneumonia, and lung cancer. And when he died, he took his secrets with him, leaving behind, once again, more questions than answers. Lisa's case remained at a standstill. Then, in 2013, Detective Peter Headley of the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office took over the investigation, and he was determined to uncover the truth about Lisa's real identity. But despite his efforts, there were still no breakthroughs. By the end of 2014, Lisa herself suggested that they try checking ancestry sites again, pointing out that the databases had grown significantly in the years since their last attempt, and Headley agreed. They started by having Lisa submit her DNA to Ancestry.com. The results yielded 2 distant matches, 4th and 5th cousins. Now, it wasn't much, obviously. 4th and 5th cousins, it's several times removed, but it was better than the results they had gotten a few years prior. It was definitely a start. Wanting to expand the search, Headley reached out to DNA Adoption, a website that specializes in helping adoptees identify birth families through DNA analysis. In 2015, genetic genealogist Dr. Barbara Ray Venter responded, offering to help. Looking back, she later admitted that Lisa's case was especially difficult. She said, quote, "The Lisa case was actually kind of difficult because normally when you're working with adoptees, you have some information. You know where they're born. You have a birth date. In Lisa's case, we had no idea where she was from. All we had was her DNA." End quote. So with no names, no locations, and no concrete details to work with, Dr. Ray Venter started working backwards, hoping to find more relatives who could help piece together Lisa's past. And she had no idea that the work she was about to do wouldn't just solve Lisa's case. It would lead to the long-awaited answer in the Bear Brook murders.
Yeah, this is a fascinating case. I'm completely hooked. But I think we should just do a quick recap before we put a pin in this episode because, candidly, it's a lot of information and it's kind of skipping around a little bit. It all makes sense, but it's kind of skipping around a lot. And I wrote a lot of notes down and maybe there's some things that I got wrong. So just to kind of recap quick, we have these barrels that are discovered on November 10th, 1985, okay? You have the 4 victims. I'm putting them all together. We know they weren't found at the exact same time, but all 4 victims, 2 different barrels, 150 yards apart, outside this Bear Brook mobile park, maybe connected to the mobile park, maybe not. Then you fast forward to 1986, where this guy shows up at this other trailer park in California, and he's got this young girl with him, Lisa, right? Fast forward through that, things go down. He has to, take off. He takes off. He leaves the little girl behind. At this point in the story, she's approximately 20 years old, still doesn't really know who she is. Then we fast forward after 1986 to 1999. Insoon comes into the picture. She meets this guy. His name's quote unquote Larry. We know how that story plays out. He ends up killing her. And what's important there is he kills her in a similar manner to what we find in New Hampshire. Now, that could be just coincidence. I'm sure a lot of cases involve dismemberment, but there was also some precautions taken to try to hide up the murder, right? As far as the kitty litter and all this stuff. So I would say on the surface, if you're looking at these two murders, the Barrels and Insoon's murder, I'm not automatically coming to the conclusion that they're connected. What's important here is what you're laying out for the entire episode, is that this guy, different names, same person. And although there's no connection to New Hampshire yet, I think what we're going to find is that this young girl, Lisa, which is probably not even her real name, is somehow going to be that connecting factor, is somehow going to be the link, the missing puzzle piece to connect the Bear Brook murders to what we got going on in California. And it's amazing how it turns out, because a lot of cases, and we're finding it more today, genetic genealogy, even the cases that we're solving through Criminal Coffee, it's genetic genealogy. That's the way it's happening. And at the time,
they're amazing.
At the time, as you mentioned, in 2013, 2014, it was still relatively new. It wasn't as prominent. You think about it, the first time we really started hearing about it wasn't until the Golden State Killer, right? And so that's much later. So this is definitely a case where at this point you have a few different stories going on. And then I think maybe next part, it's going to all tie together and it's going to be like, okay, light bulb moment. Here's how this monster is connected to all three incidents.
Yeah, and I mean this whole genetic DNA thing. It's solved a lot of mysterious sorts of cases in the past decades. And if you think about it, it's very interesting because they've known about the link to genetics and DNA and stuff since basically the 1860s, right? They realized that certain traits and things are passed down from parent to child, et cetera, and they've known about this stuff since the 1860s. And then in 1902, they discover the chromosome theory of inheritance. In 1909, the word gene was used for the first time. It was coined. In 1911, they discovered that chromosomes carry genes. They did this with fruit flies. It's very interesting. And then they kind of continue going through as the years go by. 1943, they discovered that DNA has a regular periodic structure. In 1944, they discovered that DNA transforms cells. They also discovered in 1944 that they have something called jumping genes. They're learning so much. It's moving at such a fast rate. But then when you get the DNA databases put up and you kind of have an understanding of how genes work and how DNA is passed down, now it's up to basically people to put their information into these databases. And that's where things slowed right down, because there was an issue of privacy and there was an issue of not understanding the technology.
Oh, yeah.
And being kind of afraid of it. And then with the Golden State Killer, everybody was kind of in an uproar about that because they were like, hold on, like we could be responsible for our family members going to prison for murder without even our
just
knowledge.
Law enforcement looking at their DNA profiles. A lot of people don't like that. They don't like the fact that law enforcement can go in there and use it as an investigative tool.
Exactly. And I understand that.
I actually, believe it or not, I do too.
Yeah.
That's not what they're submitting their DNA for.
No, it wasn't. And now you have to... when you submit to these places, you have to basically click something and agree that you understand your data may be used in criminal cases, in criminal investigations.
Yep.
So, and a lot of people still don't want to do that.
No, I get it. Can you imagine, be well after us, but not even well after us, 10 years from now, wait till you see how we're covering cases and how frequent they're being solved. It's incredible. Like I say it all the time. The window of opportunity for the criminals is getting smaller and smaller and smaller, which is obviously a good thing because science is catching up so much now, especially you think about not only the actual science, but the technology portion of it with AI. Man, you really got to dot your I's and cross your T's if you want to get away with a murder now.
You
really do.
Still people do, honestly.
Still people do, but I would argue that there's, 50% of the homicides in this country are unsolved. A lot of them are older cases, and even those cases are now going back and they're applying that science and technology to those cases and solving them. So that number, in my opinion, is going to shrink rapidly over the next 10 to 25 years.
Yeah, but here's the thing. This also, all of these advancements and all of these breakthroughs are being known by the criminals too, right? So
that's true.
In the 1980s, when these barrels are found, this whole connecting things through genetic genealogy wasn't a known thing that was done, right?
Correct.
So whoever left those barrels there, they're not going to think, that they may tie these people to me eventually through genetic DNA. But now the criminals know. So once again, they're just going to get more creative. You're not going to find bodies just being left out in the open anymore, which gives you, a starting point. You're just going to find a bunch of missing people whose bodies we can't find.
That's honestly the only way to, it's not like we're giving advice that they don't already know. The only way would be for that body to never be discovered. The problem is, just like in this case, they didn't plan on those bodies being found. Now, maybe they would take more measures if they thought it could be found, especially like you said, with the science and technology available today, but they're going to have to do that because any even microscopic amount left behind, if found by investigators, it can be uploaded to a database which may link them or their victims to another case and may ultimately tie back to the actual offender. So yes, it's going to be a back and forth. We're going to make adjustments. The bad guys are going to make adjustments and so forth. My hope is that unless they just leave zero trace of any crime whatsoever, they're going to get caught. They're going to get caught. That's the hope. But I'm looking forward to next week. I really want to see how this one plays out. I know this is a 3-parter, so there's a lot more to go in the story, and I really like where we are. I hope that little synopsis at the end kind of tied it all together as far as the timeline, because it does jump around a little bit, but it really does make sense what we're looking at here. This young girl, Lisa, is going to be the link from California to New Hampshire. She's going to connect the two coasts, and you have to tell the story of Insoon because that just gives you a little bit of a look into who we're dealing with. We might not know his name yet, but we know what type of person he is, and he's a monster. So that's what we have. Anything else to say before we wrap this one up?
No, I'm excited to do part 2, though.
Absolutely. All right, guys, we appreciate you being here. And we did hit 300,000 subscribers on the last video. That's Sunday. Again, thank you so much. We wouldn't be here without you guys, and we're going to keep moving forward. We got more plans for the future, ways we're going to become innovative, ways we're going to maybe see you guys a little bit more often. We've talked about different opportunities, but at minimum, we just enjoy what we do. We love covering these cases with you guys, and we're looking forward to covering more in the future, which will bring us to next week when we see you again, right?
Absolutely,
All right,
yes.
everyone stay safe out there. Have a good night. Bye.
Bye.